Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Brendan Matthews. I'm the Dean of Faculty and Curricular Development, and I want to welcome everyone here to the 2024 Book One Lecture. In a minute, I'll ask my colleague Kate Glavin to introduce our speaker, but first, I'd like to say thanks to all of you who have turned out on this first Thursday of the first week of classes to share its time with us. Throughout the year, the Simons Rock community comes together in this space to mark important moments on our calendar. In October, we'll have the keynote talk for the Symposium on Social Justice and Inclusion. November brings Founders Day, when we celebrate Elizabeth Blodgett Hall's vision of a college that broke the mold for American higher education. And then the spring semester, we'll have the Du Bois Lecture and the Pride Week keynote all in the same space. Each of these events brings in a prominent writer, thinker, educator, or activist, sometimes someone who's all four of those, to share their words and their work with the campus and to engage in dialogue about who we are and what we aspire to be. Every year, the Book One Lecture is the kickoff to all of these events, and I've always found it to be a really special occasion. All of our first-year students have had a chance to read and think about the Book One, and in many ways, the book creates the first bit of common ground that all of you have had a chance to share. And then to take the conversation farther and a little deeper, the author visits, and we have a chance perhaps to see the book in new ways, to hear echoes we may have only gotten glimpses of on our first read, and even to learn more about the person who brought that book into the world. You get to listen for a while, and then ask questions and share your own sense of the book with the very person who wrote it. Often when writers speak in front of groups, it's a bit of a sales pitch sometimes. You may have a new book out, and the people in the room haven't read that book yet, and you're hoping that maybe they'll hear something in it that they respond to and want to kind of meet you in the book line as they work their way out. One of the things that's exciting about Book One is sometimes it's a book that's been out in the world for a while, one that the writer may have written a while ago and has had a chance to reflect on, and to think differently about, to find themselves in a different position, to feel more strongly about than they did even when they first published the book, or have had their relationship with that change. And they get to share that with a room full of people who actually read the book. It's kind of a special thing, both for, I think, for the writers and for those of you who are here to engage in this back and forth. So this is a special opportunity, this sharing, and I hope that during your time at Simons Rock, you'll continue to come back, to show up, to listen, to think, and to share with your classmates and your teachers and with our invited guests your thoughts about whatever the topic happens to be for any of these convenings that we have here in the McCollum Theater. So now I'm going to step aside and turn things over to Kate Glavin, who's the Associate Dean of Studies for the Academy and first-year students, and allow her to introduce our Book One lecturer. Thanks.
Hi, it's so good to see all of you. Thank you, Tracy, for being here. In Wade in the Water, Tracy K. Smith refers to angels, her angels, as emissaries for something she needed to see. It's also how I would describe Smith's work. An emissary showing us something we need to see, but not just showing, zooming out and in, expanding to the whole world and narrowing to a person than the self. The poems take us in and out of time, to sorrow and waiting, to pleas, prayers, letters, the song. They tell the story of what's protected and what's protecting. We go so many places in Smith's work, to space, to China, to Brooklyn, to Camp Nelson, Kentucky in 1864. Or how a student put it yesterday, as we read My Children. I would have probably never read Spotwell Bryce's letter if I hadn't first read this poem. Then there's this even bigger thing happening in Smith's work, what I believe her poems are asking us to see. The world and everything in it as people we love. Our younger sister, our mother or father, our friend. Smith's poems ask us to expand. They ask us to widen our empathy. Tracy K. Smith is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, memoirist, editor, translator, and lettist. She served as 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019, during which time she spearheaded American Conversations, celebrating poetry in rural communities with the Library of Congress, created the American Public Media podcast, The Slowdown, and edited the anthology American Journal, 50 Poems for Our Time. Smith is the author of 5 poetry collections, Such Color, New and Selected Poems, which won the 2022 New England Book Award. Wade in the Water, which is awarded the 2018 Annis Wolf Book Award. Life on Mars, which won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize. Do It Day, winner of the 2006 James Laughlin Award of the Academy of American Poets. And The Body's Question, which received the 2003 Kate Cannon Prize. Her memoir, Ordinary Light, was a finalist for the 2015 National Book Award in Nonfiction. She is the co-translator of My Name Will Rise Like a Tree, Selected Poems of Lillet, which was a finalist for the 2021 American Poetry Prize, and co-editor of There's a Revolution Outside, My Love, Letters from a Crisis. Her memoir, Manifesto, To Free the Captives, A Plea for the American Soul, was a Time Magazine and Washington Post Best Book of the Year, and the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Among Smith's other honors are the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Academy Fellowship of the Academy of American Poets, the Harvard Arts Medal, the Columbia Medal for Excellence, an Essence Literary Award, and the Harold Washington Literary Award. She is a professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University, and a Susan S. and Kenneth Alwell Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Please welcome Tracy K. Smith.
Thank you so much, Kate and Brendan, and thank you for being here. And thanks for spending time with my work. I'm excited to talk a little bit about Wade in the Water and some of the larger questions about erasure and citizenship that the book helped me to clarify for myself. And I'm also really excited to hear your questions and to be in conversation. I have been thinking and writing about erasure as a practice, and I thought the first bit of this chapter that I'm working on might be a useful on-ramp into talking about Wade in the Water and some of the values that it's helped me to define for myself. And so it opens with a little bit of an anecdote, and there's a reading of a poem by a British Ghanaian poet named Victoria Adukwe-Gole that we'll go through together. And then I'll talk about my own poem declaration and what that experience is grounded in. And so I guess I'll say there's a poem that I'll read to you that you haven't read, and that I'll talk about that you don't have before you at a certain point in this talk. And what I hope you might lean back toward is the feeling of being a child, being read to, and allow what you hear and what the poem invites you to see, feel, recognize, and remember into the space. And to trust that where your mind wanders during the poem is productive and welcome. And that's a way of saying, I'm sorry, I don't have a slideshow, but I get so sick of those. So let's just be, I'll let you listen with me. So this is the first bit of an essay called On Being Nobody. And it's part of a book I'm working on for general readers about poetry as what I'm calling a spiritual technology, poetry as a practice and an art form that brings us in touch with the large selves that we and others are. And it feels like a useful technology to claim in the face of what feels like many diminishing habits that we have. Habits grounded in electronic technologies and platforms that make us hasty, that embolden us to stop listening to others or listen with the intention of refuting. And so trying to think about an alternate framework of being. So On Being Nobody. And I'll thank you in advance for helping me to hear some really new thinking and writing. But Kate mentioned Ordinary Light. In that memoir, I talk a little bit about my first encounter with the poet Emily Dickinson. I was 11 or 12. I was in the 5th grade when I happened upon her widely anthologized poem, in a school book that begins, I'm nobody, who are you? I'll just read that poem in case it's something you haven't read or haven't read recently. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They banish us, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell your name the livelong day to an admiring bog. The voice on the page, from the many dashes and exclamations, struck me as breathless, as if the speaker had hurried across some distance to catch me up in her excitement. Under these circumstances, the word nobody struck me as different than I had understood it up to that point. It wasn't an absence of presence, not a dearth of importance, not even an error or a false impression, the way a telephone or doorbell might seem to ring, though when you go to answer it, nobody's there. No, Dickinson's nobody felt rich with character and spirit, like the kind of friend I most longed to meet, who could teach me to see whole worlds in empty spaces and hear music in what passed for silence. She knew all about me. She seemed to want to claim me. Why else would she have gone to such trouble to catch me alone and to assure me that we too were something as special as a pair? I felt the power of words like dreary and live long in the poem's second stanza, words I seldom myself used. Dreary was a word that signaled the particular gloom of boredom. Things are dreary to children who have what they need, but for whatever reason lack what they want. On dreary days in my own home, I was often told to sit and read or entertain myself at an otherwise quiet task. But live long conjured ardor, the exhaustion of being too busy and at something too burdensome. One of the only places I'd heard that word before was in a song we kids were often encouraged to sing. I won't sing because I can't, but I'll say the words to the song. I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. A song about day in, day out drudgery, sung by a character whose sole dream of reprieve is that someone will blow the whistle, signaling the end of the work shift. Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow your horn? I've been working on the railroad like other popular children's songs from my childhood has its origins in minstrelsy, a form of entertainment created to assure white audiences that Black people were little more than children, gullible, disinclined to work, wanting nothing but to loaf and joke, sing and play. In the framework of 19th and early 20th century minstrelsy, Blacks were routinely characterized in ways that downplayed the injustice of slavery and the convict leasing system. Instead, these tunes enforced the impression that Blacks sang and fooled, beholding their lot in life before and after emancipation, not as brutal or unjust, but merely dreary. By the same distorted characterization, when Blacks weren't shucking or bucking duty, they were making popular entertainment out of their own despair. Minstrelsy as an art form originated to reinforce and codify the notion that Black people, economic pawns, were nobodies, inconsequential, unworthy of empathy or genuine regard, like the speaker in yet another popular minstrel song who sings over and over again, "Oh Susanna, don't you cry for me." The legacy of racial caricature gave birth to abiding stereotypes about Blackness, how we are presumed to look, to feel, to act, what it is assumed that we want, the means to which we will go in order to get what we crave and avoid what we have coming. The weight of these stereotypes upon my life, even as a child in the 1970s and 80s, surely had bearing upon what made the paradox of Dickinson's nobodiness so compelling to me, because it affirmed the depth and discernment a quiet part of myself knew I possessed. To stand alone, or be willing to revel confident in an unadvertised complexity, and to know enough to guard such capacities as precious. These assurances, I'd heard them before from my parents, became ever more appealing because of the way they operated alongside the images in Dickinson's poem. Suddenly, the popular people, the institutions authorized to judge me, and even the part of me that sometimes felt willing to become less myself in order to fit in with those and other sites of longing. Suddenly all of that became the leak of frogs belching and bellowing out from the depths of a cold fog. The slick, glabrous skin, the viscous murk of those overgrown waters, the desperate, incessant crooning and croaking. Confronting such a scene in all its sensory detail, you don't seek to parse the nuances of gain and loss, integrity and compromise. Quickly and decisively, you react. If that murky mess is full of somebodies, I'd rather be nobody. Of course, it's more than that too, isn't it? Because the power to invite or exclude, condemn or anoint is also quite literally about power, to which not all, relatively few in fact, are granted access. I wasn't. Neither were my parents, though their authority was understood to be absolute in our household. I didn't know anything about her when her poem first held me in thrall, but even Dickinson, born into an elite 19th century family, was frustrated by the manifold barriers to validation she faced as a woman seeking to publish her poetry. And yet, her poems rebuke to systems of validation that fail to recognize us or to see us correctly came through. The people who snub, judge, and expect the worst of us. The feeling of being sized up and passed over. It made sense that Dickinson's nobodiness was a refusal to accept diminishment, a way of saying, I draw my authority from within. And like the black folk humor I'd been exposed to, which used laughter to poke holes in the presumed authority of our detractors, Dickinson's poem even dished out its rebuke with a dollop of humor, attaching a word like public, the awareness of which usually put a person in the crosshairs of considerable judgment or scrutiny, to something as low down and unimposing as a frog. Likewise, the poem's sonic closure hinges on a similar dressing down of external admiration, something common wisdom insists we must endeavor to earn by anchoring it to or submerging it within the depths and the blunt line of the word log. Yet there's more still to unpack, isn't there? Because those assurances I've grown up with, hearing my parents reminders like, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, were given to me most fervently in moments when my young self needed to be built back up, having suffered the heartache of exclusion. Perhaps Dickinson's poem is an earnest attempt on behalf of the poet to build herself back up from a moment of pain or doubt. After all, a large part of the consolation of poetry as an art form stems from the fact that poems emerge not from what poets have already mastered, but from the lessons and realizations they are compelled to reckon and struggle with, sometimes over and over again throughout the span of a life. That struggle doesn't happen off-site. The poem itself is an artifact of struggle, a roadmap to the shifts, leaps, Hail Marys, and patterns of attention that have given way to momentary insight, clarity, and unburdening. Dickinson's nobodiness bears witness to forms of erasure and diminishment that do manage to unsteady us, whoever and wherever we are. And yet it goes so far as to embrace erasure as a sign that the aggrieved are distinct and discerning, not to mention present and feeling in the poem and in the world. It is a hard-won composure, one easily ruptured, hence the poem's one warning: don't tell, they banish us, How do you banish nobodies? Perhaps you pull them away from themselves, from the solace of kindred company. In another of Dickinson's versions of the poem, the line reads, don't tell, they'd advertise, as if the ultimate punishment for the peace of hard-won self-sufficiency would be to see it intruded upon and nullified by the horde. Victoria Adukwe-Bully's poem, The Ultra-Black Fish, spotlights the ease with which an external gaze, bringing with it conscious and unconscious motives and expectations, can enact a form of erasure upon its subject. I'll say one thing before I read this poem. I'll say two things. The first is dignified and sensible. There are moments in this poem where a word has been struck through, but it still is visible to the reader. And so I guess what I'll do is read the strike through and then say no and correct it. The no that I'll say, which is just a signal to you, the change, it is not in the poem. And then the other thing I'll say is I'm wearing an Invisalign, and so I really hear a lot of interference with my speech, and I'm really sorry if it's making it hard to understand me. The ultra-black fish. 200 meters down, the light stops. Many deep-sea creatures alive at this level of the ocean have developed the ability to create light for themselves. This is known as bioluminescence. Others, on the contrary, contribute to the darkness by adding themselves to it. Ultra-black fish are one example, and in 2020, 16 varieties of these were captured. The level of pigment in their skin was so high that it was found to absorb 99.956% of the light that touched it. Karen, a marine biologist, made the discovery, came upon them by accident. Instead of hauling up the deep sea crabs she had been searching for, her net produced a fang-toothed fish that wouldn't show up in a photograph. Held later in a tank under 2 strobe lights, the fish became a living black hole with no discernible features beyond the opacity of its silhouette, as though it had cut itself out of the image and left. Scientists believe that the fish developed their invisibility to aid them in escaping their predators. Another theory suggests that the obscurity of ultra-black fish enables them to more successfully catch their prey. It is likely that both ideas are true. Commentators on their discovery is excised, have also speculated that the chemical structure of the pigment could serve the development of military and defense technologies. Nothing was said, however, about how ultra-black fish find and enter into relations with each other. Nonetheless, their existence alone is evidence that, invisible as they may be to others, they are by no means strangers to themselves. That poem appears in Bully's volume Quiet, which was published in 2023. The Ultra-Black Fish is a found poem, compiled almost entirely of journalistic coverage of research conducted in the summer of 2020 by US-based marine biologist Karen Osborne. But gestures within the poem also resonate subtly or emphatically with events from that same summer of global racial uprising following the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, including debate around the value of Black lives, and various confrontations in which white women deemed Karens were caught in cell phone videos challenging the rights of Black citizens to be present in public parks, in front of their own homes, or elsewhere in space and time. Part of what this poem invites the reader to discern is the degree to which Blackness has been associated in the public imagination with chaos, intrusion, and threat, with its strike-throughs and corrections, and via its articulation of unasked questions and logic, the popular imagination has failed to ponder. The poem also offers a correction or recalibration of these deeply ingrained habits of perception. If every poem enacts a literal plunge or descent from the title, which sets up questions and expectations in the reader's mind, down into the body of the poem, where those first inklings will be affirmed or redirected, the first line of The Ultra-Black Fish delivers us to a place that is alien and inhospitable. 200 meters down, the light stops. That verb, stops, furthers the impression that we have gone too far. It's not that the light dwindles to nothing or that it fails to penetrate this depth, but rather that, as if of its own better judgment, it has put on the brakes. This sense of danger persists for me via the use of the word alive in line 2, which bears the shadow of its opposite, dead, as opposed to saying living, which brings with it the active possibility of, say, thriving. Nevertheless, the creatures operating at this depth have evolved tactics of survival. They, quote, create light for themselves, end quote, or else they, quote, contribute to the darkness by adding themselves to it, end quote. How do these phrases further inform my experience of the poem? For one thing, they impart an aura of judgment with their stark distinction between the light and the darkness, and the impression that all life at this depth is forced to choose sides between one force or the other. I'd even say that the color field of black in the species name, ultra-black fish, and in a statement like, the level of pigment in their skin was so high, inherently activates a reader's awareness of race. To claim not to notice this coincidence might be a matter of going out of one's way in order not to see color. Gradually, the poem's spotlight shifts from the anomalies of the ultra-black fish to the scrutiny to which the species is subjected, and the authority Karen, a marine biologist, is afforded in her role. As a corrective to this historical pattern of granting white interlopers the authority to intrude into Black life, foreign or external agency in the poem is dialed back via those strike-throughs, so captured, replacing discovered, or came upon them by accident, replacing made the discovery. And those strike-throughs insist that a reader recognize and process the intervention that has occurred. As the poem makes this case, it also asks the reader to recognize the distinct vocabularies that have been attached to Blackness and whiteness, not merely in this poem, but in everyday life. One is stark, dire, riddled with terms of predation and non-compliance, like wouldn't show up, or a living black hole with no discernible features, or cut out and left, escaping their predators, catch their prey. While the other, visible despite redaction, is calibrated to assert dominion, discernment, and expertise. Patterns of history where invaluable resources are mined from occupied territories in order to enrich a colonial power are even echoed in those lines. Commentators have also speculated that the chemical structures of the pigment can serve the development of military and defense technologies. The poem, up until this point, resonates as uncanny, not because Bully has labored to plant these details where they do not exist, but rather because she has happened upon evidence of these pervasive patterns of perception, power, and permission in the darkness of the deep sea, where we wouldn't have expected them to be replicated. The moment when a poem leaps free of its established patterns is exciting, because it is so often a gateway to unexpected feeling, observation, and discovery. The most breathtaking moment in Bully's poem comes for me after the terms of argument have been elaborated, just at the moment when a new vocabulary enters in. Bully has said that apart from the few corrections to the text that has been struck through, the only non-found text in her poem occurs in the final 4 lines. I'll read them again. Nothing was said, however, about how ultra-black fish find and enter into relations with each other. Nonetheless, their existence alone is evidence that, invisible as they may be to others, they are by no means strangers to themselves. Beyond evidence, beyond further illustration, what this shift brings into the poem is an alternate vocabulary of perception. We're led into a rich, mysterious nothing that defies the lexicons enforced by habit. That nothing, like the vast, overwhelming expanse of the sea, includes all that has not been seen, all that has eluded capture. It is the place where any and everything is yet possible. I take it as an invitation to stretch beyond the by now familiar terms that have played out in the poem and upon the earth throughout the ages. What would it look like to envision or to wait to be shown the dynamics of relation, care, and self-making that are possible or even preferable for those who have been held in the most constrictive regions of the global imagination? We are not any longer talking about fish. We're being invited to imagine what liberation of the imagination might look and feel like. What would be possible for everyone were we to but swim beyond the predictable dynamic of power and subordination? And in the slow meantime, as we wait and work to unlearn old patterns of scrutiny, there's consolation in the poem's assurance that members of the scrutinized species of the poem are well equipped to recognize and receive one another. I hear a little chime in my own private memory of Dickinson. There's a pair of us at that moment in the poem. Inscrutable to most, they, like the myriad nobodies in our midst, are by no means strangers to themselves. I offer that as one way of maybe demonstrating what my reading of a documentary-based poem might allow me to do, to gather, to glean, to make loud in my mind. And those are also some of the principles that help me write my way forward toward a poem based in documentary methods of my own. But more than that, to listen in a way that might allow language that is received to resonate in multiple directions and to challenge me as the poet as well. Erasure in poetry is a method of operating upon that which remains, to many, undeciphered within the field of a familiar text. But that's only part of the undertaking. By a further tilt of the imagination, the practice of erasure asks us to conceive that which remains as yet unimagined in the field of what passes for common reality. In inviting readers to look more closely at or listen more intently to what's been taken for granted or accepted without question, erasure is a way of countering the everyday negations that relegate people, all of them somebodies, to nobodies in the scheme of power. The redaction of an existing text unburies unexpected evidence as testimony and delivers it to those whose experience it affirms or corroborates, while also making it legible, even undeniable, to those who don't operate at the frequency of nobodiness and to whom it may therefore be news. The challenge of writing a poem in this way is to listen to or with the given text while remaining free of a predetermined agenda. To allow the text itself to alert you to fresh insights, useful counterpoints, and uncanny parallels. As a writer who's worked in this very mode, I always tell myself that if I approach the originating text looking merely to criticize or dress down its author or originally intended audience, I'll discover nothing but my own ego, balanced as it were atop its high horse, and the poem will fail. But if I can go gently, attentively, and trust that language and time can work together to unburden any text from the original intent for which it may have been written, then I might trust that other forms of clarity can be liberated to reveal themselves. So I'll give you an example from one of the poems in this book. In April of 2017, I attempted an erasure of the US Declaration of Independence. I was looking for some kind of otherworldly help in reviving a sonnet that I had previously written and published in contemplation of Thomas Jefferson, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence. Something about that earlier poem continued to befuddle me. I felt myself to be talking only toward my own notion of Jefferson. The poem hadn't yet managed to reach or even fully believe in Jefferson as an entity alive in spirit or mind, and perhaps even still pondering his own life's work. And so I figured that listening to some relic of his voice might allow a further form of contact to occur. And if that unsettled me as a spooky proposition, it did, slightly, I assured myself that though opinions differ as to what documents like the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence intend, the collective American imagination insists that the Founding Fathers live on through these, their, quote, living documents. Another way of saying that is, I have this belief that language plus time equals clarity. And so what Jefferson in his lifetime might have been invested in defending or framing may not any longer be a preoccupation of him, wherever and whatever he is. And perhaps his voice on the page might be willing to approach a different point of view, or to authorize a different point of view. So the first thing that I noticed in setting out to kind of find or hear Jefferson was that I had read the Declaration of Independence in school, but I'd never opened myself up to it in the way that listening for some scrap of his voice and with it his personal message to me required me to do. And that feels like a real shift in stance. You know, the difference between reading something like this and reading something as if there is something earnest and intimate that is being delivered to you, even from an unlikely source. To enter into an encounter with a poem you are reading or a poem you are endeavoring to write, and to be met there by the unwavering attention of a voice that has rushed across all manner of space and time to reach and entreat you, is to be invited to believe, even briefly, that you are unique and irreplaceable in the universe. I think all poems do that if we read them in the right way, which means openly, attentively, and vulnerably. And what if the voice that reaches you, like Jefferson's on its path that day to me, belongs to someone who, in their own lifetime, may never have chosen or even deigned to address you in such a way? And what if I were to insist that it felt as though Jefferson and I were facing one another, not as strangers, but as co-equals, two souls sparked at the same instant from eternity, What forms of reparation between living people and between people and their living institutions might be enabled by a voice caught at just the right angle on a page? My own poem, Declaration, written, or it seemed rather deciphered, swiftly on that April day, relates what Jefferson emphasized to me as his rapt audience of one. I know you've read this poem, probably talked about it, but I'll read it so you can hear how I hear it. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. What animates Declaration is a willingness on the part of one of the text's original authors to lend this appeal for freedom from an unjust colonial authority to me, and with me, my entire race. And maybe that's a huge assertion, but I think it reveals something about what I believe the act of writing is, which is a form of collaboration. So in a poem like this, it's easy to say, oh, I'm seeking to collaborate with the voice or the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. But I also really do believe that the poem that is wholly original, that's coming from my own experience or my own imagination or questions, is also seeking to collide with another source of knowledge, presence, or insight, or even music that can help bring my thoughts into the place where they would not otherwise be able or willing to go. And that other kind of distance is, I think, in part what makes a poem for me. And I think that form, even a form like erasure or a form like a sonnet, is something that poets often use to engage the conscious mind with a task so that this other part of our awareness or our being can do this large order kind of work, moving away from the self and its certainties towards something else that might shed even momentary light. Jefferson seemed to say to me, "This is what you seek," or "This is what you need to see." I was stunned to find such effortless parallels between the document's cited grievances against the government of England and generations of Black people's pleas to this country for freedom and a full portion of citizenship and justice. As I see them, each of the dashes in my poem opens onto a surging sea of examples. One line that startled me as the poem is being composed is, "and altering fundamentally the forms of our," which my ear involuntarily completed with the word families. But the dash also insists that there is always another answer, always another layer of evidence willing to lend itself to each of these gestures. I hope it also invites the reader to populate the poem's silences, i.e. its redactions, with their own understanding of what is withheld. Once at a reading in Washington, D.C., an audience member told me that the poem's final silence in her ear contains the word witness. She activated a possibility that had not previously occurred to me. I had been thinking about the weight or what I often refer to as the freight of history. Both are compelling to me, and neither should be made to foreclose upon the many other valid terms of hope, loss, need, and resilience to which the poem lends credence. Rhythm, emphasis, silence, inflection, mystery, candor, flashes of insistence, irreducible complexity, these things and others besides are tools by which poems seek us out in the fullness of our humanity, selves unperturbed and undiminished by the pressures, dismissals, and vicissitudes of power and normativity. If it's possible to imagine that such a form of regard exists, should it not have some bearing upon what we might be allowed to expect for and from ourselves? By which I mean, we whom habit and custom have rendered nobodies, and you who have been counted among the sons and daughters of this nation's never-gone fathers, must come to accept that all of us together inhabit and are responsible for a common reality. So I'll leave off of that piece of writing there, but I fully understand that the notion that a common reality binds and contains us all is easily contested and mightily contested for many reasons. I think much of the work that Wade in the Water seeks to do is to find a way to feel safe in common reality and to find a way to feel present and seen. I started writing the bulk of this book around 2016, when our political discourse changed drastically, and when I felt in my day-to-day life the frightful nearness of antebellum history. And I wanted to find out what could help me not to feel afraid. And one direction that I thought to look was back toward history, because, as I said, there are voices, perspectives, and presences there that we have been acclimated to hearing in a certain way and to expecting certain things of, that I, in my desperation, needed to believe had more still to offer, even contradictory bits of wisdom or confession from what we might imagine those voices or those documents were sites of. And I would say that that wish to feel seen, present, and safe isn't just part of what lives in the poems that are most obviously documentary, like the long Civil War sequence. I will tell you the truth about this, I will tell you all about it. Or the brief sequence, The Greatest Personal Privation, which draws from letters written within a slaveholding family to build or intuit the voice or the voices of the people who were enslaved to them. Voices that the archive doesn't have much evidence of in their fullness and specificity. So those are things that are maybe obviously connected to a wish of like getting more out of the sense of what we in this nation have always been and might remind ourselves that we are. But there are other poems written in the day-to-day in what was then my life in New York and Princeton, New Jersey, that might allow me to say, if I'm listening for new forms of truth and insight, what if I can also begin to look out toward others in a way that might allow me to see what habit has caused me to negate or to fail to expect? And maybe before we go over to that table and have a conversation, I'll just read, I'll read one really brief poem that in some ways is also a poem about nobodiness and the trap of believing that others are out of the range of our concern. And so this is a brief poem toward the end of the book called Beatific. beatific. I watch him bob across the intersection, squat legs bowed in black sweatpants. I watch him smile at nobody, at our traffic stopped to accommodate his slow going. His arms churn the air. His comic jog carries him nowhere. But it is as if he hears a voice in our idling engines, calling him live, swift, prince of creation. Every least leaf shivers in the sun, while we sit, bothered, late, captive to this thing, commanding, wait for this man, wait for him. Thanks for listening. I'm really excited for whatever questions you might have.
Yeah, if anyone has questions,
Oh,
if
okay.
the light isn't too much in your eye.
Or do you want to join me?
Direct traffic is
And also,
I mean, you would talk about some specific poems that you guys might have been drawn to, or you have ideas or questions about. I'm happy to read any of those or excerpts of them if that would be helpful.
Who wants to go first? Hey, over here.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. I have a couple of questions related to what you said. Number one would be on the proposition of somebody and another-ness, which seems to continue even through colors and races. So we should give us, talk a bit more about that. And then there's a kind of chromatic opposition, which you also find at the time we're talking about fish, the darkness and the deepness in the water. Then number two, I wish you could say a bit more on the declaration, which normally we find so many times at the beginning of a constitution or a declaration of independence. And maybe you could say a bit more the kind of adaptation you use.
What was the last thing? The kind of what?
How you've adapted it to your writing. And then finally, when you're reading the book, there is here and there a religious tone, which we find in the titles like Annunciation, like Notification, etc., which are the things we're going to find in some religious readings. So I wish you could talk about yourself, religions, and the way you may have put that in your writing.
Okay, I'll try and touch on each of those. Is that the full question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll start with the religion. I grew up in a faithful family. Both my parents were Black Southerners, and I think the Black church had been a site of, like religious vocabulary, but more than that, a site of community, a place where they were assured during Jim Crow, when very few institutions were assuring Black people of this, that they mattered, that they were gathering into something that was meaningful, and that they themselves were, counted among, God's creation. And those are lessons that are theological, but I think they're very social as well. So the vocabulary of religion, the vocabulary of the King James Bible were kind of like instilled in me from the youngest of ages. And I've come to understand, largely through writing poetry, that I'm very interested in the large questions that theology gives us grounding in, but I also have a lot of anxiety about the uses of religion, about the human handprint upon the vision of God and the universe. So the book, the previous book of poetry that I wrote before this, Life on Mars, I think is a book that's really trying to think, what do I need this, the fact of belief in me to be able to speak to and activate for me. And it's a book that is really thinking about, for me that meant, well, what do I do with my grief? Having lost both my parents, what does the afterlife, what do I need the afterlife to look like? What do I need God or the divine realm to be invested in? And what can I hang on to if I can build that system out in such a way that I don't have to say goodbye to the people that I love who have passed on? So having written that book, I realized I have a lot more questions about God, about the soul, about eternity, notions I like a lot. And so they come, they come into my poems quite a lot. And I think part of that isn't that I'm looking for them, but like I said, I'm listening for something to intersect my known vocabulary, my habits of thought and speech, and sometimes what intersects is, it feels cosmic, or maybe that's what I'm looking for, something that takes me out of the closed systems that we convince ourselves that we belong to. And maybe in some ways that notion of a closed system goes back to some of those questions about, somebodies and nobodies, about racial difference and the discourse of danger and threat across the line of racial difference, of any kind of difference. All difference in our culture has been weaponized, and in very hierarchical ways. And so in some ways, trying to think in a different geometry is something that maybe brings the vocabulary of faith or the divine back in. I'm trying to remember exactly. Oh, you were asking a little bit more about the poem Declaration. The first, I think I mentioned, so the first act of trying to find Jefferson in a poem was very much grounded in discomfort with the man. And the poem that I wrote, using my own, vocabulary and trying to give myself a formal constraint like a sonnet to move around differently within what would come naturally out of my mouth, it didn't do the trick of bringing me away from this sense that I was confronting someone who I mistrusted, somebody who I really just wanted to hear apologize. And so that poem lives somewhere, but it feels to me like a missed opportunity. And so I wanted a harder constraint. I wanted to tie, that side of my imagination behind my back. And so to say I'm going to find what might be a better form of dialogue by using his language, not my own. And once I sat down to do that, like the earnest wish to lose me and find him, that known document began to speak in ways that I hadn't been looking for before. And so what I heard, reading the poem, reading the text in 2017, was an exactly parallel articulation of political grievance against an authority that was deemed unjust. Something exactly parallel to the history of Black grievances and pleas against injustice and for citizenship and justice. And what that rhyming did for me was to say, we're completely authorized. This is a document that has been given such power in our nation and in our imagination, in our sense of what we what we are authorized to do as citizens, or what this collective that we form believes in. And it told me generations of people that I descend from who suffered and who struggled and sacrificed are completely justified in their pleas. And that felt like, I want to say like a lightening, you know, the burden of the age, the burden of thinking about the presidency, the burden of thinking about violent, barely disguised rhetoric that pitted people against one another. All of that felt, like it was being called into question, not just by me and not just by people who look like me. And that felt really frightening and exciting, if that can make sense. That poem was published in the New Yorker late in 2017, maybe at the end of the year, and I got an email from another poet who said, "You won't believe this, but I was working on an erasure of the Declaration of Independence, and I heard some of the very same things," and so she shared with me. And so I feel like, I feel like this is a message that perhaps Jefferson is allowing to become in wider circulation. And I kind of I'm half serious when I say that.
Anyone else have a question that would like to ask?
So in the process of reading this book, a lot of what I was struck by is the feeling of truth, particularly within theatrical improvisation and act. A lot of what I was feeling is like seeing these scenes and histories and realities and features that are presented to us. They're not quite my own, but they feel so vaguely familiar. And within that, I am understanding that everything presented to me is true. Even though I may not fully understand it, it is true, and it's a reality that exists. And so my question for you is, in the process of writing this, were there any truths or realities that you unearthed within yourself from the journey of discovering this?
I love that question. I think that the way a poem invites us to be present is a mode or manner of listening that is expecting something that's honest and useful, and maybe even more than that, urgent. And so I like that you're describing that, your vocabulary for that is truth. And it's easy for us to say, oh, everybody has their own truth, you know, but to imagine that what comes out of someone else's experience is not just true and useful and valid for them, but somehow it's essential to my own understanding of what is true and useful and valid for me. I think that's what poems are about. And I think that the mode of engagement with a stranger, when you're sitting over this poem and you're really doing everything you can to hear it, and, you know, poems they don't talk to us for the most part. The people in conversations or in passing speak to us. They're peculiar, and they move upon the page in a way that asks us to be in a different form of attention. And so to hold that in good faith is something that it's exceedingly rare, and not just in our culture, but just I think in like human engagement. And I really don't know what else to say, but I think there's much more truth available to us, but we have to adopt that mode of receptivity. And this book, in some ways, a lot of the poems feel like thought experiments by which I'm seeking to put myself in that receptive mode. So one of the last poems in the book, Refuge, where I'm saying, if I can imagine these strangers as people I know I love, can I love them? Can I believe that what they're offering and experiencing is truth, as you call it? Or a poem, you know, the brief poem that I read as well. And those are thought experiments geared toward a fuller kind of citizenship. That's what I really think. Can you tell me again, what was the question, part of your question?
Were there any personal truths where that was revealed to you in the process of writing the water?
Well, I'm asking every poem to startle me into claiming something that I hadn't known was true. Let me think if I can think of an example. Well, one poem that sort of startled me was The Angels. It's early in the book. And it begins, I actually have to look at, I don't want to remember my poem incorrectly.
We'll have to check your sources.
Okay. All right, okay. So this is, I'll just read the first couple stanzas. Two slung themselves across chairs once in my hotel room, grizzled in leather biker gear, emissaries for something I needed to see. I was worn down by an awful panic, a wrenching in the gut, contortions. They sat at the table while I slept. I could sense them with a deck of playing cards between them. So that poem begins in a place of fright, place of anxiety. And it's a poem in which I'm really kind of thinking about what in reality is like a terrifying dream in a moment of great personal distress of these biker, just grizzled Mad Max kind of angels who had a message for me, a truthful message for me. And so the poem is like trying to think about what that source of truth or divinity could really be like. And the mind of the speaker, or my mind in the poem, wanders. So it goes from that story, and it goes, it begins to start looking at the everyday environment in which I live and claiming the fact that I believe there's more there. There are things that terrify and fascinate me. And it was only through coming upon a hitch in language where I think the poem's true subject revealed itself to me. And that hitch is at the bottom of page 6. Just those two, that once, and never again for me since. Though there are there sightings, flashes, hints. And I think those first 3 lines of that stanza, which in my mind, it creates a little bit of an echo chamber, or like a little room of mirrors. I think it allowed the direction and intention to shift a little bit, to find like the truth of the poem for me, which was really about the presence and the absence of my mother. A poem about mortality, a poem about the large and terrifying reality or truth that sits beyond our vision, but that we can allow ourselves to be present to. And maybe there's one other poem that felt in some ways like that, which is the poem An Old Story, which it gives the next book such color its title. And that poem also goes back, I think, to that question about racial division and how it's been so animated. And it's a poem that's seeking to create a different myth, a new mythology that might lead us out of these habits and patterns that are destructive and that ultimately seek to justify destruction towards something that might be rooted in love or care, belief in one another. But it goes through a dark place. There's a large silence in the middle of that poem as I read it, which begins with a long age past. And I'd like to stretch that out because I think that's where we are right now. So the leap across that gulf of silence is also about making a choice. What's the choice I want to allow myself to wish for? I think that How many of you are writers? How many of you write poems? Those moments in a poem where you don't know where to go, how to get there, or what the poem is for, are the moments that tell you your poem is working in the right direction, where something is there for you. If you can be brave or strange or credulous and get there. And I feel like so often the things that I say make me feel like, oh, there are probably 8 people who are like, this is really stupid. Like to say, oh, Thomas Jefferson sat down with me one day and he authorized me to hear this in the Declaration of Independence. It's really a naive thing to say, but I think it's also a really important stance to be willing to adopt, to step into something that might simply be wishful or foolish, that could, if you allow yourself to trust it and then to refine it a little bit through craft-based choices, that could lead to something that I think productively changes your view of the reality that we share, common reality, and what it could be.
Thanks for that question. Daniel, have a question? Road.
First, I'd like to say I'm sorry for your loss. So this question is a little similar to both the ones that we had, but it's, what did you learn about your place in the world as an artist while you were doing this?
That's a really good question. Well, one effect of writing these poems, in particular going toward places that I've often shied away from, and the Civil War suite is like one of the big places I've always avoided, probably based on how the Civil War was taught to me when I was in high school. Going toward those sites of angst and listening for the presence of other people has been greatly consoling and emboldening. So this is a book that arose in many ways out of anxiety and unrest about, 21st century America. And listening to, I like to think sitting down at the feet of these voices of Civil War veterans and their family members, Black soldiers and their family members and descendants, recognizing the faith, recognizing the courage and the belief in the tenets of democracy and the insistence to hold this nation that didn't yet see them as citizens to those tenets eased my fear. Because I realized there have always been people of conscience and courage present and participating. And I think it made me think, what am I doing here sitting, like biting my nails and worrying? What can I do that could be an act of conscience and courage that might be useful, that might, allow another person like me who's afraid or maybe even cynical to admit a kind of hope into the vocabulary in what feels like a dark moment. That felt really exciting, to say I can minister to my own worst fears, and in doing so find, a mighty assemblage of other souls who not only did that, but in some way through their voices continue to do that. That felt really, really useful and constructive.
Thanks for the question. Does anyone have a question if they would ask? No. Go back in the middle.
You seem to have like a personal connection to the poems you write, like your connection to Dickinson and Jefferson, and the way that you kind of inferred this to yourself. Is that something that you've always kind of felt, or is that learned? Is that something
When I first, my first reaction would be to want to say yes to your question, but then I think writing the poems. A lot of the poems I wrote when I was a younger poet, when I was in graduate school, or even when I was beginning to work in earnest on my first book, I had a hard time positioning myself as an authority within the poem. And I use that word authority quite deliberately because what I thought poets were doing was making authoritative statements, delivering insight. And so I was trying to do that, and I didn't have authority to yield or wield, and I didn't feel like I had a lot of experience to have given me insight. And so my poems would like get a little bit down the page and then I'd be stuck. And it wasn't until I started to think about what really happened in other people's poems that I could say, okay, poets ask a lot of questions, and they do not always, in fact, they quite frequently do not answer the questions. They activate a kind of curiosity and a set of possibilities that the reader can ponder with them and make into a productive private or collective act. And they also offer a lot of space in their poems to other people or presences, like animals, to the natural world, and to other people's lives and even voices. And so I think what got me over the hump was to say, if I don't yet know what my story is, what my life is about, what if I make my poems for now about listening to or even imagining toward others? So a lot of the poems in my first book, which is called The Body's Question, a number of them are persona poems. I know that's a more fraught enterprise now. But I honestly do believe that when a poem is really rooted in listening and seeking to honor another person's story or voice, it's more possible to do it without harm or appropriation. There's always those risks. And a lot of the poems are also poems that allowed me to break the silence on my own experience and perspectives by way of another person. Maybe an easier example is there's a poem in my second book, which is called After Persephone. It's a poem, that purports to be written in Persephone's voice, reflecting on her marriage, Hades, but it's actually a poem that helped me kind of talk about my divorce, for the first marriage that I was in that ended. And suddenly I realized that looking toward another life allowed the hard and true and necessary that was really mine to find its way into my own poems. And so that was a real, an authorizing moment in a way. And I know those tactics are still useful and present to me. And partly, it's not maybe that I'm shy anymore, but I'm not always aware of the value of what is happening to me. And so if I can step out of my own perspective and into that of maybe even a counterpoint, the poems that come from personal experience or experience I feel myself to be close to can teach me things. One example of that is the poem The United States Welcomes You in this book, which is a poem about, the scenario is that someone is being apprehended or interrogated. I wrote that poem thinking about the preponderance of police violence against unarmed Black citizens, but it also invokes citizenship because of the title. So it's like, what happens across these lines of difference that causes so much violence or misunderstanding? I couldn't get over my own cherishing for the potential victim in that poem, the person who is being apprehended. Everything I said from that perspective or from my own perspective felt like a platitude or like I was preaching. And so I literally walked to the other side of the encounter and spoke from the perspective of the person with the weapon and with the mistrust and with the assumptions. And one of the things that was instructive to me in doing that was how easy it was for me to do that, how steeped I am, and I think we all are, in the vocabulary of mistrust, of racial profiling, how this is part of the American imagination that we've been initiated into, and that felt useful to be somehow indicted in the very wrong that my poem was setting out to challenge. And then the other thing that also became useful for me, and maybe for some readers, was the evidence of vulnerability within the voice of that authority figure, and the evidence of maybe even fear of accountability that dwelled there as well, which felt to me incredibly hopeful. It made me think perhaps there is something that we might be willing to either fear or seek to honor, that could pull us out of some of these deeply ingrained habits of conflict and disparities of power. So sometimes we can find ourselves better by going toward others, I think.
I think we have time for one more question. If anybody would like to ask.
I wanted to, ask a little bit on, what does erasure mean to you? And, I was thinking about this as you were speaking, and kind of the idea of confronting perspectives that we believe to be wrong, or that we know to be wrong from our own understanding, and how the concept, especially with the idea of the declaration, that you take the words of someone that you previously wanted to confront with, because you didn't believe in their ideology, but then coming into the idea of taking the declaration and, founding a new perspective by placing yourself, even unwillingly into their shoes, and understanding or trying to comprehend that kind of idea, even though it feels so, I'm trying to think of a word, but foreign, because it's not by any means what you believe or what could be right. And I think so. How do you think erasure as a concept offers the collection of different perspectives and allows you to find yourself within that kind of storm of possibilities, I guess?
Yeah, it is a storm of possibilities. I spent a lot of time tonight saying Jefferson came to me, Jefferson addressed me, but I was also coming to this other voice and putting a kind of attention, which is a form of pressure, upon that language in an effort to alleviate it of some of the weight of that, or the suffocating intention. And so in some ways, maybe erasure is, if it is a form of intervention, it's collaborative, because you're not starting from scratch. And if you go too far toward what you believe ought to be there, the poem fails, and you know that when that happens, or it's worthwhile only because it allows you to almost like a pep rally. We can find what we want to find in this, but to together move towards something that is neither in one camp nor the other feels useful to me. Maybe I'll give you one last example, which is from a more recent body of work. I taught for many years at Princeton, and Woodrow Wilson was a former president of that university and been celebrated for most of the institution's history. And then in 2020, after years of requests or demands for students and alumni that his name be dissociated from the university, the trustees decided they would remove it from the School of Public and International Affairs and from a residential college. And so I said, I'm gonna celebrate and mark this decision, which I thought to be correct, by finding, I found an essay that Wilson had written in celebration of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And I want to find something surprising and just worthy of this moment within that. And it took me several drafts to get out of the habit. And I think what happened was I stopped thinking about what I needed to hear Wilson say and what I wanted to illuminate about him. And it was very easy at first to see him say, you know, we know the full measure of this man's life, and talking about Levi through celebration. You know, it's easy to ironize that or invert it. But then there was a moment where a very different message began to be legible to me. And part of that had to do with the gulps of silence I was willing to endure, to say I'm going to use this word, and then 5 pages later, here's another word that guides me somewhere that I hadn't anticipated. And so at the end of that poem, which is called Found Poem, there are these lines. If you love a country that does not, was conceived not to want you, I want to remind you, we live. And the poem goes on a little bit, but suddenly something broke through. And to be patient, this is almost what it feels like, to be sitting there across, the table, like a little table with somebody that you might think of as an adversary, and to say, wait, let's be patient, we can get there. And to find a message that's not in my voice and not in his voice it feels like so much of it has to do with the intention that it allows or forces you to find within that gesture. So for me, erasure is about a kind of patient surrender, and then the ability to be startled beyond that which I'm seeking. At least that's what it is now. It may change. I teach some documentary poetry workshops at Harvard, and my students are finding different source material and finding, messages in ways that are similar but also quite different. And even choosing to demonstrate the fact of redaction in different ways. Often in my poem it's white space, but the bully poem that I opened with, or early in that talk, used visible strike-throughs, blackouts, or another. I think it creates another energy, and that energy, the visual energy that puts you in a certain mode of feeling spaciousness or feeling entrapped, also probably contributes to the effect of what that counterpoint message is. I was afraid of bound poems and redactions or erasures for a long time, and I found a use for them. And that use is really rooted in some of the questions and hopes that I have about, what it means to be a soul on earth. But you will probably find other uses and other theories about what the practice does, because you have other questions or you have other apprehensions. And I think that's a really exciting thing, that a form as emphatic as erasure can offer so many different degrees of emphasis or trust or collaboration.
Thank you for that. Everyone, please join me in thanking Tracy K.
Thank you.